Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, by David W. Blight, narrated by David Colacci. The people made their recollection fit in with their sufferings. Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Prologue. History does not refer merely to the past. History is literally present in all that we do. James Baldwin, Unnameable Objects, Unspeakable Crimes, 1965. The Civil War is our felt history lived in the national imagination, wrote Robert Penn Warren in his Legacy After the Civil War, 1961. Somewhere in their bones, he declared, most Americans have a storehouse of lessons drawn from the Civil War. Exactly what those lessons should be, and who should determine them, has been the most contested question in American historical memory since 1863, when Robert E. Lee retreated back into Virginia, Abraham Lincoln went to Gettysburg to explain the meaning of the war, and Frederick Douglass announced national regeneration as the sacred significance of the war. Among those lessons, wrote Warren, is the realization that slavery looms up mountainously in the story and cannot be talked away. But Warren acknowledged another lesson of equal importance for Americans of all persuasions. When one is happy in forgetfulness, facts get forgotten. Or, as William Dean Howells once put it, what the American public always wants is a tragedy with a happy ending. This book is a history of how Americans remembered their most divisive and tragic experience during the 50-year period after the Civil War. It probes the interrelationship between the two broad themes of race and reunion in American culture and society, from the turning point in the war, 1863, to the culmination of its semi-centennial in 1915. This is necessarily, therefore, a synthetic and selective work on a vast topic. I am primarily concerned with the ways that contending memories clashed or intermingled in the public memory, and not in developing professional historiography of the Civil War. All historians make research decisions and impose categories on the infinity of evidence and on the enormous variety of human stories embedded in their subjects. This book is no exception. Reconstruction politics, reunion literature, soldiers' memory, the reminiscence industry, African American memory, the origins and uses of Memorial Day, and the Southern lost cause receive considerable attention in this work, while other important forms and voices of memory do not, such as monument building, late 19th century presidential politics, business enterprise, or the gendered character of America's romance with reunion. I have ignored none of these themes, but in every chapter have kept my eye on race as the central problem in how Americans made choices to remember and forget their Civil War. Throughout, I tell the stories of Civil War memory with the divergent voices of North and South, black and white, joined in the same narrative. And in every chapter I have tried to tell stories by using the power and variety of American voices, presidents and generals, men and women, former foot soldiers and ex-slaves, master novelists and essayists, as well as the thousands who crafted ordinary reminiscences, romantics and realists, the victors and the vanquished. Three overall visions of Civil War memory collided and combined over time. One, the reconciliationist vision, which took root in the process of dealing with the dead from so many battlefields, prisons, and hospitals, and developed in many ways earlier than the history of Reconstruction has allowed us to believe. Two, the white supremacist vision, which took many forms early, including terror and violence, locked arms with reconciliationists of many kinds, and by the turn of the century delivered the country a segregated memory of its Civil War on Southern terms. And three, the emancipationist vision, embodied in African Americans' complex remembrance of their own freedom, in the politics of radical Reconstruction, and in conceptions of the war as the reinvention of the Republic and the liberation of blacks to citizenship and constitutional equality. In the end, this is a story of how the forces of reconciliation overwhelmed the emancipationist vision in the national culture, how the inexorable drive for reunion both used and trumped race. But the story does not merely dead-end in the bleakness of the age of segregation. So much of the emancipationist vision persisted in American culture during the early 20th century, upheld by blacks and a fledgling neo-abolitionist tradition, that it never died a permanent death on the landscape of Civil War memory. That persistence made the revival of the emancipationist memory of the war and the transformation of American society possible in the last third of the 20th century. Americans faced an overwhelming task after the Civil War and emancipation: how to understand the tangled relationship between two profound ideas, healing and justice. On some level, both had to occur. But given the potency of racial assumptions and power in 19th century America, these two aims never developed in historical balance. One might conclude that this imbalance between outcomes of sectional healing and racial justice was simply America's inevitable historical condition, and celebrate the remarkable swiftness of the reunion, as Paul Buck did in his influential book The Road to Reunion, 1937. But theories of inevitability, of irrepressible conflicts or irrepressible reconciliations, are rarely satisfying. Human reconciliations, when tragically divided people unify again around aspirations, ideas, and the positive bonds of nationalism, are to be cherished. But sometimes reconciliations have terrible costs, both intentional and unseen. The sectional reunion after so horrible a civil war was a political triumph by the late 19th century, but it could not have been achieved without the resubjugation of many of those people whom the war had freed from centuries of bondage. This is the tragedy lingering on the margins and infesting the heart of American history, from Appomattox to World War I. For many whites, especially veterans and their family members, healing from the war was simply not the same proposition as doing justice to the 4 million emancipated slaves and their descendants. On the other hand, a simple justice, a fair chance to exercise their basic rights and secure access to land and livelihood, were all most blacks ever demanded of Reconstruction and beyond. They sought no official apologies for slavery, only protection, education, human recognition, and a helping hand. The rub, of course, was that there were many warring definitions of healing in the South, and the nation's collective memory had never been so shattered. In the wake of the Civil War, there were no Truth and Reconciliation Commissions through which to process memories of either slavery or the experience of total war. Defeated white Southerners and black former slaves faced each other on the ground, seeing and knowing the awful chasm between their experiences, unaware that any path would lead to their reconciliation. Yankee and Confederate soldiers, however, would eventually find a smoother path to bonds of fraternalism and mutual glory. As is always the case in any society trying to master the most conflicted elements of its past, healing and justice had to happen in history and through politics. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote with insight about this historical dilemma that has so plagued modern nations. "The process of historical justice," said Niebuhr, "are not exact enough to warrant the simple confidence in the moral character of history. Moral judgments are executed in history, but never with precision. Every execution of moral judgments in history is inexact, because of its necessary relation to the morally irrelevant fact of power." Americans have had to work through the meaning of their Civil War in its rightful place, in the politics of memory, And as long as we have a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?